The moment I saw Patricia standing in my driveway with her clipboard and that familiar scowl, I knew my Tuesday was about to get a whole lot worse. I had just pulled up in my truck after picking up 3 bags of road salt from the hardware store in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I'd lived for the past 4 years. Winter was coming early this year, according to all the forecasts, and I wanted to be prepared. My driveway had a notorious slope that turned into a skating rink at the first sign of ice. "Frank Zimmerman," Patricia called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about those bags in your truck bed." I climbed out slowly, already feeling the tension building in my shoulders. Patricia Henderson had been the president of the Meadowbrook Community HOA for 3 years now, and in that time, she'd made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our covenant with the enthusiasm of a military dictator. "It's just road salt, Patricia," I said, keeping my tone even. "For my driveway." Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that all chemical materials must be stored in an enclosed structure, out of sight from the street. She rattled off without even looking at her clipboard. She'd probably memorized the entire rulebook. "Those bags are visible from the road and you're in direct violation." I glanced at my truck. The bags were still in the bed, covered with a tarp. "I literally just got home. I'm about to put them in my garage." "The violation occurred the moment you pulled into your driveway," Patricia said, her pen already scratching across her clipboard. "I'm issuing you a warning today, but if I see any chemical storage violations in the future, it'll be a fine of $250. "You've got to be kidding me." "I don't kid about community standards, Frank." She tore off a yellow copy of the violation notice and thrust it toward me. "The rules exist for everyone's benefit. We have a creek running through our neighborhood, and improper storage of chemicals could lead to environmental contamination." That was rich coming from her, but I didn't know that yet. I just took the notice, feeling my jaw clench as she walked away, her sensible beige flats clicking against my driveway pavement. My neighbor Dave was getting his mail across the street. He gave me a sympathetic wave. "Let me guess, Patricia. Who else?" I called back, hauling the first bag of salt out of my truck. Each bag weighed 50 pounds, and my back reminded me that I wasn't 25 anymore. At 42, these things took a toll. I'd bought my house in Meadowbrook, a planned community just outside Harrisburg, because it seemed nice enough. Tree-lined streets, a small park, and yes, a pretty creek that ran along the back of several properties. The HOA fees were steep at $350 a month, but I'd figured that was the price of suburban living. What I hadn't counted on was Patricia Henderson. Over the next week, I forgot about the salt incident. I stored the bags properly in my garage, stacked neatly on a plastic shelf I'd bought specifically for the purpose. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, and by early December, we'd already had 2 significant snowfalls. I used the salt sparingly on my driveway, mostly just spreading it before storms to prevent ice buildup. My property had a slight grade toward the street, and the last thing I needed was to slip and break something on my way to work. I was a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant in Camp Hill, and missing work wasn't an option. The third time Patricia showed up at my door, it was a Saturday morning. I was enjoying my coffee and watching the news when the doorbell rang insistently. 3 times, quick succession. I opened the door to find her standing there with another woman I recognized as Deborah Crawford, the HOA vice president. Both women looked like they'd dressed for a funeral, all dark colors and severe expressions. "Frank, we've received complaints about salt residue on your driveway," Patricia announced. The white staining is visible from the street and constitutes a violation of our aesthetic maintenance standards. I stared at her. It's rock salt, for ice prevention, for safety. Other residents manage to keep their driveways safe without leaving unsightly stains, Deborah chimed in. She was slightly younger than Patricia, maybe 55 to Patricia's 60, but just as committed to the HOA cause. It's winter. Everyone's driveway has salt on it, I said, my patience wearing thin. Yours is excessive, Patricia countered. And we've also observed that runoff from your driveway appears to be flowing toward the street drain. We're concerned about the environmental impact. The driveway slopes toward the street. That's how it was built. That's how every driveway in this neighborhood works. Patricia made a note on her ever-present clipboard. Regardless, we're issuing a formal violation notice. You have 14 days to remediate the situation, or you'll face a fine of $500. $500 for using salt on my driveway, for excessive chemical use that violates our environmental protection standards, she corrected. We take our responsibilities seriously, Frank. The Meadowbrook Creek is a valuable natural resource, and we won't allow residents to pollute it with their carelessness. After they left, I stood in my doorway, holding yet another yellow violation notice, feeling my blood pressure rising. This was insane. I was using road salt the same way everyone else in Pennsylvania used it during winter. It wasn't excessive. It wasn't careless. It was practical. I called Dave later that afternoon. He came over with a 6-pack of beer, and we sat in my living room, looking out at my perfectly normal, slightly salt-stained driveway. She hit me last year for having my trash cans visible for more than 12 hours after pickup, Dave told me. Cost me $200 because I was out of town and couldn't move them right away. This is getting ridiculous, I said. What am I supposed to do? Just let my driveway turn into an ice rink? You could try the sand and salt mixture, Dave suggested. Less visible, still effective. Or I could fight this. Dave gave me a long look. Nobody fights Patricia and wins, Frank. Trust me. Better to just comply and keep your head down. But I wasn't the keep your head down type. Never had been. At work, I was known for challenging bad processes, for asking why things had to be done a certain way if that way didn't make sense. It had made me some enemies over the years, but it had also made me good at my job. The next morning, I drove down to the public library in Harrisburg and started researching. If Patricia was going to cite environmental protection standards, I wanted to understand what those standards actually were. What I found was interesting. According to Pennsylvania's environmental protection regulations, residential use of road salt wasn't prohibited, but it was supposed to be applied responsibly. The state had guidelines about quantities and application methods, mostly aimed at municipal operations and commercial properties, not individual homeowners. But more interesting was what I found about HOA authority. HOAs could create rules, sure, but those rules had to be reasonable and couldn't violate state or federal law. They also had to be applied consistently to all residents. That last part stuck with me. Applied consistently. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to my neighbors' driveways. I drove through the neighborhood during my lunch break, noting which properties had salt stains, which ones had visible salt storage, and how everyone else was handling winter maintenance. What I discovered made my blood boil. At least 15 houses in Meadowbrook had similar salt staining on their driveways. Several others had bags of salt visible in their garages or carports, but as far as I could tell, I was the only one who'd received a violation notice. Then I noticed something else, something that would change everything. The HOA had its own maintenance shed, a small building tucked behind the community clubhouse. And piled up behind that shed, barely concealed by a chain-link fence, were at least 20 bags of ice melt and several large containers labeled as de-icing solution. I took photos. Lots of photos. I documented everything with timestamps and GPS coordinates, using my phone's camera. Then I started researching what the HOA actually did with all those de-icing materials. Meadowbrook had about 2 miles of walking paths that wound through the community, including a popular trail that ran alongside the creek. During winter, the HOA was responsible for maintaining those paths, keeping them clear and safe for residents. I walked the creek trail on a cold Wednesday afternoon after work. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the bare trees. The creek itself was beautiful, about 15 feet wide at most points, with clear water flowing over smooth stones. Ice had formed along the edges, creating delicate crystal formations. But as I walked, I noticed something troubling. White residue covered much of the path, way more than what was on my driveway. The salt had been applied heavily, almost excessively, and anywhere the path had a slope, I could see where runoff had carved little channels through the remaining snow, leading directly into the creek. At one point, where the path crossed a small drainage culvert, I saw a white crust of salt buildup so thick it looked like frost. The culvert fed directly into the creek, and I could see the discoloration in the water where the salt-laden runoff was entering. I took more photos. Video 2. I documented a half-mile section of the path, showing the excessive salt application and the clear evidence of runoff flowing into the creek. When I got home, I started drafting an email to Patricia and the HOA board. I attached photos, cited the relevant sections of Pennsylvania environmental law, and pointed out the apparent double standard in enforcement. I sent it at 9 p.m. that night and felt a grim satisfaction hit the send button. The response came faster than I expected. By 6 a.m. the next morning, I had an email from Patricia, copied to the entire HOA board and the community's lawyer. The email was curt. My complaint was noted, it said, but the HOA's maintenance practices were professionally managed and complied with all applicable regulations. My violation notice stood, and I now had 9 days to remediate the situation or face the fine. Furthermore, the email stated, if I continued to harass HOA board members with baseless accusations, I could face additional sanctions for creating a hostile community environment. I read the email twice over my morning coffee, feeling something harden inside me. This wasn't just about salt anymore. This was about fairness, about accountability, and about not letting someone abuse what little power they had. I called out sick from work that day, something I rarely did, and drove to the office of an environmental consulting firm in Mechanicsburg, about 20 minutes away. I'd found them online, and their website said they specialized in water quality testing and environmental assessments. The receptionist was friendly, and when I explained what I needed, she set me up with a consultation with one of their environmental scientists, a man named Dr. Gerald Morrison. Dr. Morrison was in his late 50s, with gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent his career dealing with complicated environmental issues. We sat in his small office, and I showed him all my photos and explained the situation. So let me get this straight, he said, studying my photos on his computer screen. Your HOA is fining you for using road salt on your driveway, claiming environmental concerns, while they're using substantially more salt on community paths that drain directly into a creek. That's exactly it, I confirmed, and I'm apparently the only one being targeted for this. He leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. Well, that's certainly problematic from a consistency standpoint, but let's talk about the actual environmental impact. You're right to be concerned about salt runoff into waterways. It's a significant issue, especially in the Northeast. How significant? Very. Road salt, sodium chloride, increases the salinity of freshwater streams and can harm aquatic life. Elevated chloride levels can affect fish, amphibians, macroinvertebrates, and plant life. Pennsylvania has water quality standards that limit chloride concentrations in surface waters. I felt a weight settle in my stomach. So I am damaging the creek with my salt? Potentially, yes. But so is everyone else who uses salt in the watershed. The question is one of scale and management. He clicked through my photos again. From what you're showing me here, the HOA's application looks far more problematic than typical residential use. They're applying salt directly adjacent to the creek, with clear runoff pathways. That's much more concerning than salt from a driveway that has to travel through storm drains and detention basins. Can you prove that? I can test it. We'd need to take water samples from the creek, both upstream and downstream of the HOA path areas, and analyze them for chloride concentration. If the levels exceed Pennsylvania's standards, or if there's a significant increase downstream of the HOA's salt application areas, that would be evidence of pollution. How much would that cost? He pulled out a calculator and did some quick math. For a basic assessment, taking samples at multiple points, analyzing for chloride and a few other parameters, writing up a brief report, I'd estimate around $1,500. I didn't hesitate. Do it. You're sure? That's not a small investment for what's essentially an HOA dispute. I'm sure. When can you start? Dr. Morrison checked his calendar. I can get out there this week. Friday morning work for you. I'll need you to show me the area. We shook hands, and I left his office feeling like I'd finally taken a real step forward. This wasn't just complaining anymore. This was gathering actual evidence. Friday morning was cold and clear. I met Dr. Morrison at the community clubhouse parking lot at 8 a.m. He arrived in a pickup truck with his company's logo on the side, carrying several equipment cases and a clipboard of his own. "Show me around," he said, pulling on a pair of rubber boots. We spent the next 2 hours walking the creek trail. Dr. Morrison moved methodically, stopping at various points to examine the water, the path, and the surrounding area. He used a GPS unit to mark locations, took his own photos, and made detailed notes. At 6 different locations, he collected water samples, carefully filling bottles with creek water and labeling each one with the location, time, and conditions. He took samples both above and below where the paths came close to the creek, and at points where runoff channels were clearly visible. "This is concerning," he said at one point, crouching near a drainage culvert. He dipped a probe into the water and his meter beeped. "The conductivity here is elevated, which usually indicates dissolved salts." "Is that bad?" "It depends on the concentration, which is what the lab analysis will tell us. But yes, elevated conductivity near a runoff source is usually a red flag." He also examined the HOA's salt storage area behind the maintenance shed, photographing the bags and containers. "No secondary containment," he noted. "No spill prevention measures. If it rains heavily or if a bag tears, that salt is going straight into the ground and eventually into the creek." "Is that illegal?" "It's not compliant with best management practices. I can tell you that much. Whether it violates specific regulations depends on the quantities and the exact circumstances, but it's certainly not good environmental stewardship." The sampling took most of the morning. A few residents passed us on the trail, giving us curious looks but not asking questions. I half expected Patricia to show up and demand to know what we were doing, but she didn't appear. Results should be back in about a week, Dr. Morrison told me as we finished up. I'll compile everything into a report for you. If the data shows what I think it's going to show, you'll have a strong case. The waiting was torture. Every day I checked my email obsessively, looking for Dr. Morrison's report. Meanwhile, my 14-day deadline from the HOA was approaching. I had 4 days left when the report finally arrived. I printed it out immediately and read through it twice, my anger growing with each page. The report was damning. Dr. Morrison had found chloride concentrations in the creek that exceeded Pennsylvania's aquatic life protection standards at multiple points downstream of the HOA paths. The highest concentrations were found directly below the drainage culverts, where the path runoff entered the creek. Upstream samples showed normal, baseline chloride levels, but downstream of the HOA maintenance areas, the levels spiked significantly, sometimes 2 to 3 times higher than the safe threshold. The report included graphs, maps showing sample locations, and photographs documenting the salt application on HOA paths and the inadequate storage behind the maintenance shed. Dr. Morrison's conclusions were clear and professionally stated. The HOA's winter maintenance practices were contributing to water quality impairment in Meadowbrook Creek, likely in violation of state environmental regulations. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the report for a third time, feeling vindicated and furious in equal measure. Patricia had threatened to fine me for environmental violations while the HOA itself was actually polluting the creek. The hypocrisy was stunning. I made copies of the report and prepared my next move carefully. I wasn't just going to send this to Patricia. I was going to go bigger. First, I submitted a formal complaint to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, attaching Dr. Morrison's complete report. I cited the specific water quality standards being violated and provided all the documentation showing the HOA's practices. Second, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board, again attaching the report and formally objecting to my violation notice. I pointed out that I was being selectively targeted while the HOA itself was engaged in practices that were actually harming the environment. I demanded that my violation notice be withdrawn and that the HOA take immediate steps to correct their own practices. Third, I sent copies to every member of the Meadowbrook community. Our HOA had an email directory for emergency notifications, and while technically I wasn't supposed to use it for personal communications, I figured this qualified as a community issue. I sent the report to all 230 households in Meadowbrook with a brief explanation of what was happening. That last one was probably what really set things off. My phone started ringing within an hour. Neighbors I barely knew called to express their support, their own frustrations with the HOA, and their shock at the environmental findings. Dave came over that evening, shaking his head in disbelief. "Frank, you really kicked the hornet's nest," he said, but he was grinning. "My wife is thrilled. She's hated Patricia ever since she got fined for having the wrong color door wreath. But not everyone was supportive. I got a few angry calls too, from people who thought I was causing trouble, who said I should have just paid the fine and moved on, who accused me of making the neighborhood look bad. And then Patricia called. "You have violated the HOA's communication policy," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You have defamed the board, distributed false information, and created a hostile environment. We are taking legal action against you for harassment and libel." "It's libel, not liable," I corrected. And truth is an absolute defense to libel. Everything in that report is factually accurate and scientifically verified. You had no right to conduct testing on community property without permission. The creek is public water. The paths are accessible to all residents. Dr. Morrison didn't trespass or break any rules. We'll see what our lawyer says about that. She hung up before I could respond. The next day, I received a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney, ordering me to stop making defamatory statements about the board and threatening further legal action if I continued. The letter also informed me that my violation fine had been increased to $1,000 for failure to remediate within the specified time frame, and for conduct unbecoming of a community member. I took the letter straight to my own attorney, a real estate lawyer named Sandra Mitchell who I'd used when buying the house. Sandra read through everything, including Dr. Morrison's report and all the correspondence with the HOA. "This is actually pretty clear-cut," Sandra said. "The HOA is in a bad position. They're trying to bully you into silence, but they don't have a legal leg to stand on. The report is legitimate, the findings are scientific fact, and you have every right to share that information with other homeowners. What about the increased fine? We'll fight that. It's retaliatory and it's not based on any legitimate violation. You were using road salt reasonably for its intended purpose. They can't fine you for that while simultaneously doing worse themselves." "Can we go after them?" Sandra smiled. "We can do better than that. With this environmental report, you have grounds to file a complaint with the state, which you've already done. But you could also potentially sue the HOA for selective enforcement, harassment, and even demand that they correct their environmental practices at their own expense." "I want them held accountable," I said. "This isn't just about me anymore. They're actually harming the creek and they're trying to blame residents for it." "Then let's hold them accountable." Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. The Pennsylvania DEP responded to my complaint, sending an inspector to investigate. I met with the inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Peters, and showed her everything I'd documented. Carol walked the creek trail with her own testing equipment, took her own samples, and examined the HOA's storage practices. She didn't say much during the inspection, just made notes and took photographs, but her expression grew increasingly serious as the morning went on. "This is problematic," she finally said, standing near the drainage culvert with the worst chloride readings. "The HOA has a responsibility to follow best management practices for de-icing, especially this close to a waterway. From what I'm seeing, they're not doing that. What happens now?" "I'll compile my findings and submit them to my supervisor. If we determine there's a violation, we'll issue a notice to the HOA requiring corrective action. Depending on the severity, there could also be penalties." "How severe are we talking?" Carol looked at the white crust of salt residue on the path, then at the creek. "They're impacting water quality in a way that could harm aquatic life. That's not something we take lightly. I'd expect at minimum a requirement to change their practices, possible restoration requirements, and potentially fines." The news spread through Meadowbrook like wildfire. The state's investigation became common knowledge, and suddenly, the HOA board was on the defensive. An emergency community meeting was called, mandatory attendance for all homeowners. The meeting was held in the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening. I arrived early and found the parking lot already packed. Inside, every chair was filled and people lined the walls. The tension in the room was palpable. Patricia sat at a table in the front with the rest of the board. Deborah Crawford, Treasurer Michael Barnes, and Secretary Janet Walsh. They all looked grim. Patricia called the meeting to order, her voice sharp. "We're here to address recent events and the unfounded accusations that have been made against this board." "Unfounded," someone shouted from the back. "The state is investigating you." The room erupted in cross-talk. Patricia banged her gavel, looking flustered. "Order! We will have order." It took several minutes for things to calm down. When they did, Patricia launched into a prepared statement about how the board had always acted in the community's best interests, how their winter maintenance was professionally managed, and how certain individuals were trying to undermine the HOA's authority for personal gain. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. When she finished, I stood up. "I'd like to respond to that." "You don't have the floor," Patricia snapped. "He has every right to speak," Dave called out. Several other people voiced their agreement. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Fine. 2 minutes." I walked to the front of the room, my printed copy of Dr. Morrison's report in hand. "I'm not trying to undermine anyone. I'm trying to protect our community and our environment." The HOA fined me for using road salt on my driveway, claiming environmental concerns. But an independent scientific study shows that the HOA's own practices are actually polluting Meadowbrook Creek with salt runoff at levels that exceed state water quality standards. I held up the report. "This isn't my opinion. This is scientific fact, based on water testing by a licensed environmental consultant. The Pennsylvania DEP has confirmed these findings in their own investigation. The HOA isn't just being hypocritical by fining me while doing worse themselves. They're actually breaking environmental laws." The room exploded with questions and comments. People wanted to see the report, wanted to know details, wanted to understand how this could have happened. Patricia tried to maintain control, but the meeting had effectively been taken over by angry homeowners. Michael Barnes, the treasurer, finally held up his hands for quiet. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, a retired accountant, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. "If I may," he said quietly, and the room settled down to listen. "I think we need to acknowledge that there may be some validity to these concerns. I've reviewed the environmental report, and I've spoken with our landscaping contractor about our winter maintenance practices. It's possible we've been applying salt more heavily than necessary." Patricia shot him a furious look, but Michael continued. "The board has a fiduciary duty to this community, and that includes environmental responsibility. If we're contributing to pollution, we need to correct that immediately." "Thank you, Michael," I said. The meeting went on for another hour, growing increasingly heated. By the end, the board had agreed, under tremendous pressure from the homeowners, to suspend all enforcement of winter maintenance fines pending a full review of policies. They also agreed to hire their own environmental consultant to assess their practices and recommend changes. It felt like a victory, but I knew this wasn't over. The DEP's official findings came 3 weeks later. The report was even more comprehensive than Dr. Morrison's, with more sampling points and additional analysis. The conclusions were unequivocal. The Meadowbrook HOA's winter maintenance practices were causing water quality impairment in violation of Pennsylvania's Clean Streams Law. The DEP issued a formal notice of violation to the HOA, requiring immediate corrective action. The notice mandated that the HOA reduce salt application rates on community paths by at least 50%, implement secondary containment for all salt storage areas, install sediment and salt filtering measures at all drainage points leading to the creek, conduct monthly water quality monitoring for the next 2 years, submit an environmental remediation plan within 30 days. The notice also included a fine of $15,000 payable to the state's Clean Water Fund. I heard about it from Carol Peters, the DEP inspector, who called me directly. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "Your complaint led to a pretty significant enforcement action. Good on you for speaking up." When the HOA received the notice, there was an immediate scramble. The board held another emergency meeting, this time with their attorney present. The attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Fletcher, explained the legal situation in blunt terms. "The DEP has you dead to rights," he told the board, and I heard this later from Michael, who'd become something of an ally. "You violated environmental regulations. The evidence is overwhelming. Your options are to comply with the corrective action requirements or face additional penalties, potentially including criminal charges if you ignore the notice." "This is all Frank Zimmerman's fault," Patricia insisted. "If he hadn't stirred up trouble, none of this would have happened." "No," Robert said firmly. "This happened because the HOA was breaking the law. Mr. Zimmerman exposed it. If you'd addressed your practices proactively, you wouldn't be in this position." The board had no choice but to comply. They hired an environmental consulting firm, not Dr. Morrison's company, but a larger outfit, to develop a remediation plan. The plan was expensive, requiring new drainage infrastructure, proper salt storage facilities, and new equipment for applying smaller quantities of de-icing materials more precisely. The total cost came to over $60,000, plus the $15,000 fine to the state. The HOA had to levy a special assessment on all homeowners to cover the costs. Every household in Meadowbrook got a bill for an additional $275. The uproar was immediate and loud. Homeowners were furious that they were being asked to pay for the board's mistakes. Several people called for Patricia's resignation. Others demanded a full audit of HOA finances and practices. I didn't have to say anything. The community was turning against Patricia on its own. But Patricia wasn't done yet. Despite all the evidence, despite the state's findings, despite the overwhelming disapproval from the community, she refused to back down on my violation fine. I received a letter from the HOA's attorney stating that my fine of $1,000 was still in effect, and if I didn't pay within 30 days, they would place a lien on my property. That was the final straw. I called Sandra Mitchell, my attorney, and told her I wanted to take aggressive action. "Sue them," I said. "Sue the HOA for selective enforcement, harassment, and whatever else we can throw at them." Sandra drafted a lawsuit that was filed in the Dauphin County Court of Common Pleas. We sued the Meadowbrook HOA and Patricia Henderson, personally for selective enforcement of rules, harassment, abuse of authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We sought damages for my legal fees, the cost of the environmental report, and compensation for the stress and time I'd spent fighting this. We also filed a countersuit against their attempt to fine me, arguing that it was retaliatory and baseless. The lawsuit made the local news. A reporter from the Harrisburg Patriot News picked up the story and wrote an article about the HOA that polluted the creek while fining a homeowner for using road salt. The article included interviews with several Meadowbrook residents, most of whom supported me. The negative publicity was devastating for the HOA's reputation. Other reporters picked up the story. It went regional, then got mentioned on a few national news sites as an example of HOA overreach. Patricia Henderson became something of a local villain, the face of petty tyranny and environmental hypocrisy. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board finally cracked. Michael Barnes called me one evening, speaking carefully. "Frank, I want you to know that not everyone on the board supports what's been happening. Several of us think Patricia has handled this entire situation poorly. I appreciate you saying that, Michael. We want to settle with you. Drop the lawsuit and we'll withdraw your fine, reimburse you for your legal expenses and the cost of the environmental report, and issue a formal apology. Patricia has agreed to resign as president. I sat with that for a moment. That's a start, but I want more. I want the HOA to adopt a formal environmental policy, one that prioritizes the health of the creek. I want regular, independent monitoring to ensure compliance, and I want protection from any future retaliation. I think we can do all of that. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. The HOA paid me $12,000 to cover my costs and compensate for the harassment. They withdrew my fine completely and removed any record of violations from my homeowner file. Patricia Henderson resigned from the board, along with Deborah Crawford, who'd been her staunchest ally. Most importantly, the HOA adopted a comprehensive environmental policy that I helped draft with Dr. Morrison's input. The policy mandated sustainable practices for all HOA maintenance, quarterly water quality testing of the creek, annual environmental audits, and a commitment to transparency about environmental issues. The policy also explicitly stated that homeowners following best practices for winter maintenance, including reasonable use of road salt, would not be subject to violations or fines. New board elections were held in March. Michael Barnes became president, and several new members were elected who actually seemed interested in serving the community rather than wielding power over it. The remediation work on the creek was completed by April. New drainage systems were installed, the salt storage area was properly contained, and the HOA invested in salt spreading equipment that used sensors to apply minimal amounts based on temperature and conditions. Dr. Morrison conducted follow-up water quality testing that spring and found significant improvement. The chloride levels in the creek had dropped back to near baseline levels. Aquatic life surveys showed healthy populations of sensitive species that had been declining. The creek was healing. As for Patricia Henderson, I heard she moved out of Meadowbrook that summer. Someone told me she'd bought a condo in downtown Harrisburg, somewhere without an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I stayed in my house, continuing to use road salt on my driveway when needed, but I'd learned from the experience too. I used less than before, applied it more carefully, and mixed it with sand to reduce the amount needed. I installed a small rain garden at the edge of my property to help filter any runoff before it reached the storm drains. The community as a whole became more environmentally conscious. Several other residents installed rain gardens or native plantings along the creek. There was talk of applying for designation as a Pennsylvania wildlife habitat to help protect the watershed. The whole experience had transformed Meadowbrook, taking it from a place where following rules mattered more than doing what was right, to a community that actually cared about its environment and each other. One evening in late May, I was walking the creek trail, enjoying the spring weather and watching the water flow clear and clean over the stones. The trees were full and green, birds were singing, and I could see small fish darting in the shallows, a good sign of healthy water. Dave joined me and we walked together in comfortable silence for a while. "You know, you really changed this place," he said eventually. "Before, everyone was too scared of Patricia to speak up about anything. Now people actually talk to each other, work together. The community feels like an actual community." "I just wanted to keep using salt on my driveway," I said, smiling. "No, you wanted fairness. You wanted accountability. Those things matter." He was right. The fight hadn't been about salt or money or even the creek, not really. It had been about standing up when someone abused their authority, about demanding that rules make sense and be applied fairly, about protecting something bigger than my own convenience. The salt had just been the spark. But what grew from it was a community that learned to hold its leaders accountable, to prioritize substance over appearance, and to take responsibility for the environment we all shared. My driveway still has some salt stains every winter. But now when I see them, I don't think about violations or fines. I think about the creek running clear, about the fish and frogs and birds that depend on it, and about a community that learned to do better. And that makes everything worth it. The following winter was different in Meadowbrook. The new HOA board sent out educational materials about responsible salt use to all residents. They organized a community workshop with Dr. Morrison as the guest speaker, where he taught everyone about the environmental impact of road salt and alternatives that were safer for the creek. I attended that workshop, sitting in the back of the clubhouse that had once been filled with hostility toward me. Now people came up to shake my hand, to thank me for what I'd done. It felt surreal. The HOA also set up a tool library where residents could borrow spreaders that applied salt more efficiently. And they bought a bulk supply of calcium magnesium acetate, an environmentally friendlier alternative to sodium chloride that worked well at moderate temperatures. The special assessment that everyone had to pay, that $275, remained a sore subject for some. But most residents understood that it was necessary to fix a problem that the previous board had created. And many people privately told me they thought it was worth it to get rid of Patricia and make real improvements. Michael Barnes turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He ran meetings efficiently but democratically, actually listening to homeowner concerns instead of dictating from on high. He was transparent about finances, sharing detailed monthly reports online so everyone could see where their dues were going under his leadership. The HOA started focusing on things that actually improved the community, rather than just enforcing arbitrary rules. They organized neighborhood events, improved the playground equipment in the park, and started a community garden where residents could grow vegetables together. The environmental monitoring continued as required by the DEP settlement. Every quarter, a technician came out to sample the creek water, and the results were posted on the HOA website. Everyone could see that the chloride levels remained low, that the creek was healthy, that the changes we'd made were working. In May of that year, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection sent a representative to a community meeting to present Meadowbrook with a certificate recognizing our environmental improvement efforts. The certificate noted that our community had gone from being a source of water quality problems to being a model for responsible watershed management. Standing in that meeting, watching the DEP representative praise the community's transformation, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was bigger than my personal vindication. This was about actually making a difference. After the meeting, Carol Peters, the DEP inspector who'd investigated my initial complaint, pulled me aside. "You should be proud of what you accomplished here," she said. "Most people don't fight back against HOAs even when they're in the right. They just pay the fine and move on. You didn't do that, and because of your persistence, a creek is healthier and a community is better educated about environmental protection." "I was just mad about being fined," I admitted. She laughed. "Maybe that's how it started, but you followed through. You got the science, you documented everything, you didn't back down when they tried to bully you. That takes courage." The legal settlement money I'd received, that $12,000, I ended up donating half of it to a local watershed conservation group. It felt right. using some of the money to support broader environmental protection efforts beyond just our little creek. I used the rest to finally build the deck I'd been planning for my backyard. A nice elevated platform where I could sit and enjoy the view of my yard, and in the distance, the tree line that marked the creek valley. Sitting on that deck on summer evenings became my favorite thing. I'd have a beer, watch the sunset, and think about how strange life could be. A year earlier, I'd been furious about an unjust fine, stressed about fighting an HOA, worried about legal bills and community backlash. Now I was at peace, the issue resolved, the community improved, and my own conscience clear. Dave became one of my closest friends through all of this. We'd gone through something together. That feeling of being under Patricia's thumb and coming out the other side had bonded us. Our families started getting together regularly for barbecues and game nights. His wife, Karen, told me at one of those gatherings, "You know, I think Patricia did us a favor in a weird way. She was so awful that when she finally got pushed out, everyone was ready for real change. If we just had a mediocre, mildly annoying HOA board, people would have stayed apathetic." It was an interesting perspective. Sometimes things have to get really bad before people are motivated to make them better. The following autumn, the community held its first annual Meadowbrook Creek Cleanup Day. Dozens of residents turned out with gloves and trash bags to walk the creek banks and pick up litter, remove invasive plants, and generally tend to our shared environmental resource. I coordinated the event along with Michael and a few other volunteers. We had a great turnout, including families with kids who were excited to help. We pulled out old tires, plastic bags, broken glass, and all sorts of debris that had accumulated over the years. After the cleanup, we had a picnic in the community park. People brought food to share. Kids ran around playing, and there was a genuine sense of community spirit that I'd never felt before in Meadowbrook. Michael gave a short speech thanking everyone for coming out. Then he said something that stuck with me. This community isn't just houses and streets and rules. It's people who care about each other and about the place where we live. Today shows what we can accomplish when we work together toward something that matters. People applauded, and I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, many of whom I now knew by name, many of whom had supported me during the fight with the HOA. This was what a community should be. As the years passed, the changes became permanent parts of Meadowbrook's culture. New residents moving in were welcomed with information packets that included not just HOA rules, but also environmental guidelines, community values, and invitations to get involved. The creek became a source of pride rather than just scenery. People took their kids down to the water to look for salamanders and crayfish. The local elementary school started doing science field trips to Meadowbrook Creek to study water quality and aquatic ecosystems. Dr. Morrison published a paper about the Meadowbrook case in an environmental management journal. He used it as an example of how community science and citizen activism could drive environmental improvements. He sent me a copy of the paper, and I was surprised to see my name in the acknowledgments. The paper described how an HOA resident's complaint had led to the discovery of significant water quality impairment, how scientific testing had documented the problem, and how regulatory intervention combined with community pressure had produced rapid improvements. The case study was used in environmental science classes at several universities. I never expected to become an environmental activist. I was just a mechanical engineer who wanted to use salt on his driveway without getting fined. But life has a way of pushing you into unexpected roles. Sandra Mitchell, my attorney, told me that she'd started using my case as an example when talking to other clients about HOA disputes. It shows that you can fight back and win if you're right and if you're persistent, she said. Too many people just assume the HOA has all the power. Your case proves that's not true. Looking back on the whole experience, from that first violation notice to the community transformation that followed, I realized I'd learned something important about how change happens. It doesn't usually come from the top down. It comes from individuals who see something wrong and refuse to accept it. One person speaking up can seem insignificant. But if that person is right, if they gather evidence, if they persist through opposition and setbacks, they can create ripples that spread far beyond their initial complaint. My complaint about being unfairly fined rippled out to reveal environmental violations, which rippled out to force regulatory action, which rippled out to change community practices, which rippled out to improve education and awareness, which rippled out to transform the culture of an entire neighborhood. All because I refused to just pay a fine I didn't deserve. 3 years after that first violation notice, I was serving on the HOA board myself. I never expected to do that, never wanted to be involved in HOA politics. But several residents approached me and asked me to run for a position, saying the board needed people who would stand up for principle. So I ran, and I won. My role was focused on environmental and community standards, making sure our rules made sense and were applied fairly. It was sometimes tedious work, dealing with complaints about tree trimming and fence heights and parking violations. But I tried to approach every issue with the same question. Is this fair? Does this make the community better? Is this rule serving a real purpose or just someone's arbitrary preference? That lens changed how we handled things. We revised a lot of outdated rules, eliminated some entirely, and focused our enforcement on issues that actually mattered for safety and community well-being. The difference in community satisfaction was noticeable. Fewer complaints, fewer disputes, more cooperation. When people felt they were being treated fairly, they were much more willing to follow reasonable rules. And whenever someone on the board suggested a new rule or fine, I'd ask about the science, the data, the fairness of it. I'd make sure we weren't creating another situation where we demand standards from residents that we couldn't meet ourselves. The creek remained healthy, the monitoring data consistently showing good water quality. Fish populations increased. A great blue heron started showing up regularly, fishing in the shallows, a sign that the ecosystem was thriving. Kids in the neighborhood knew that creek, played near it, learned from it. It became part of their childhood, part of their connection to nature and to their home. That was Patricia Henderson's real legacy, though not the one she intended. By being so unreasonable, by targeting me so unjustly, she'd set in motion a chain of events that made Meadowbrook a genuinely better place to live. I sometimes wondered if she ever realized that. Probably not. People like Patricia rarely see themselves as the villains of the story. She probably still thought she'd been right, that I'd been the troublemaker, that the community had turned against her unfairly. But I didn't waste much energy thinking about Patricia. She was gone, moved on to whatever new place she'd landed. My focus was on the community we'd built in her absence, on maintaining the improvements we'd made, on keeping Meadowbrook a place where fairness and common sense prevailed. My driveway still slopes toward the street. Every winter, I still put down salt when ice threatens. But now I do it carefully, sparingly, mixing it with sand and calcium magnesium acetate, thinking about the creek that flows behind my house and the fish and frogs and herons that depend on it. And when my neighbors do the same, none of us worry about violation notices or fines. We worry about doing the right thing, about being good stewards of the place where we live. That's what a community should be, And that's what we became, thanks to road salt, an environmental report, and one person's refusal to accept injustice. The lawsuit, the investigations, the media coverage, the special assessments, all of it had been difficult. But the outcome was worth every moment of stress and every dollar spent. Meadowbrook wasn't perfect. No community is. We still had disputes and disagreements and people who complained about petty things. But we had something more important than perfection. We had accountability, transparency, and a genuine commitment to doing better. And it all started because someone tried to fine me for storing road salt.